Hello, we are Luján and Marianela, and we are going to talk about bilingualism. First of all, you will ask us, but what it really means to be bilingual? Okay, let me tell you that bilingualism is defined as the ability of an individual or member of a community to use two languages effectively. That is to say, knowing two or more languages means that your brain may actually look and work differently than those who are monolingual. So, what does it really mean to know a language? Language ability is typically measured in two active parts, speaking and writing, and two passive parts, listening and reading. While a balanced bilingual has near equal abilities in the two languages, most bilinguals around the world know and use their languages in varying proportions. And depending on their situation and how they acquired each language, they can be classified into three general types. A compound bilingual, a person who develops two linguistic codes simultaneously with a single set of concepts, learning both languages as they begin to process the world around them. Then, a coordinated bilingual, working with two sets of concepts, learning a language in school, for example, while continuing speaking the other language at home and with friends. Finally, the last type is subordinate bilinguals, that those who learn a secondary language by filtering it through their primary language. Now, taking this into account, we are going to work with a research article, What Bilinguals Tell Us About Culture, Cognition and Language, written by Judith Kroll and Rhonda McClain in 2013. In this paper, the authors state that the use of more than one language is a natural circumstance of the human experience, and they assure that bilingual speakers can choose the language they want to speak and switch from the L1 to the L2. Therefore, bilinguals spend their lives negotiating between the two languages and acquire skills to select the appropriate language in a certain context. But how do bilinguals select which language they have to use? While bilingual speakers are sensitive to cultural cues, cultural signs that are in the environment, which indicates the presence of their native language. Some of these cultural cues are faces and concepts.
Zhang et al. Made an experiment which showed that this sensitivity to cultural cues has negative impact on bilinguals because when bilingual speaks in the L2, in the presence of other bilinguals who share the same L1, the L2 speech is much lower. Let's suppose that there is a Chinese-English bilingual in which Chinese is the L1. His performance in the L2 in English is going to be way less hesitant in the presence of someone who doesn't share the same L1. On the contrary, if two bilinguals share the same L1 and they are speaking in the L2, their performance in the L2 is going to be more hesitant. For bicultural individuals, visual cues of a setting's cultural expectations can activate associated representations, switching the frames that guide their judgments. In the studies carried out by Zhang et al. 2013, it is investigated the proposal that heritage culture cues hinder immigrants' second language processing by priming first language structures. For Chinese immigrants in the United States, speaking to a Chinese versus a Caucasian face reduced their English fluency, but at the same time increased their social comfort, effects that did not occur for a comparison group of European Americans. For this experiment, facial characteristics were used to prime culture. The setting was a computer-mediated conversation session with a fellow student, an American undergraduate. The Chinese foreign students participants saw their interlocutor's photograph, varied as Chinese or Caucasian, listened to his pre-recorded speech on 2 campus life topics in a standard American accent, constant across conditions, and then spoke in English into a microphone about each topic based on their own experience. Their speech on each topic was coded for fluency in 2 ways. A listener's holistic fluency impression from the whole speech and an objective count of words per minute, after standard pruning of extraneous words, repetitions, self-corrections, and so forth. Overall, a Chinese face disrupts the English fluency of Chinese foreign students, even though it elicits more positive social expectations. Although out-group interactions can induce intergroup anxiety and result in disfluency. Any such effect was more than offset by the disfluency created by the in-group Chinese face through the process of cultural priming.
This experiment shows us that native language skills, such as faces and culture, are powerful determinants of language performance. Let's now focus on the importance of faces. For infants during the early stages of language development, the face is a primary source of information about the connection between language and the social environment. In the case of infants who are exposed to 2 languages from birth, the faces are a special cue to determine which language is being spoken.
In a second experiment done by Zhang et al., it is shown that Chinese-English bilinguals are similarly disadvantaged with speaking the L2 when faced with culture-specific pictures connected to the L1 experiences. Exposure to iconic symbols of Chinese versus American culture hinder Chinese immigrants' English fluency when speaking about both culture-laden and culture-neutral topics. An alternative account for this fluency effect in Study 1 is that Chinese immigrants may feel more motivated or obliged to speak English clearly to a Caucasian listener who might not otherwise understand or accept them than to a Chinese listener. Study 2 eliminated this audience design account by testing the hypothesis in a non-conversational context with no salient audience. Instead of faces, the Chinese participants view 5 icons of Chinese culture, for example the Great Wall, or American culture, for example Mount Rushmore. Then they were asked to describe in English these culture-laden images and subsequently to narrate stories from several cultural neutral images. In sum, Chinese immigrants are hindered in speaking English by exposure to icon images of Chinese culture. This effect showed in their verbal descriptions of both culture-laden and culture-neutral items. Neither the expectancy violation nor audience design accounts can explain these effects, as priming was implemented through images rather than an audience. Unlike bilingual babies, bilingual adults may not always be sensitive to cues in the environment, so only one of the 2 languages is relevant. In fact, for instance, when reading sentences, they might activate the other language even though the other language might not be relevant. Now, in the case of late bilinguals, those who are immersed in the L2 but who have acquired it after childhood, only speaking an L1, may suffer a dissociation between culture and language. We might say that the different groups of bilinguals are all sensitive to linguistic and cultural skills. However, these skills are not going to be used in the same way to process the language. In an experiment, a group of Dutch English bilinguals had words in both languages, Dutch and English, that were spoken by native speakers of one of the 2 languages. This experiment showed us 3 things. First, the extensiveness of the speaker affected the speed of the responses of bilinguals. Second, there was no reduction to the sensitivity of homophones. That is to say that words that sounded similar in both languages were processed at normal speed. Third, even with the accent to speech, both the L1 and the L2 were activated in the bilingual's brain. The ability to speak a chosen language relies on the mechanisms that regulate the access to the cognitive control processes. These processes may be engaged differently in different forms of bilingualism, different language and cultural context.
Now, we are going to talk about pedagogical implications, as we have to keep in mind several factors such as age and previous knowledge. For us, experiential learning is a perfect tool to have successful learning. As you can realize, it is the process of learning through experience. Moreover, experiential learning theory was initially proposed by the psychologist David Kroll, who emphasized how experiences influence the learning process, called defined experiential learning, as the process whereby knowledge is created through the transformation of experience. The most important fact about learning through experience is that students learn to process knowledge, thinking, and understanding a topic like a native speaker would do. To show this idea in a clearer perspective, there are two types of memories: procedural and declarative memory. If we teach following the experiential learning ideas too, our students would use their procedural memory. In this memory, the information is encapsulated or unconscious, hence we do not have access to it, but we kind of retrieve it, because knowledge is automatized. The other memory is the declarative one. This memory is conscious or explicit, and information can be recollected. Declarative and procedural memories complement each other when acquiring the same knowledge. Thus, these two systems play a redundant role, as children can learn to process the same knowledge, although they do that in different ways. Now, let's move on to the experiential learning model. This model of learning encourages students to constantly reflect on their experiences as they develop practical skills and a better understanding of the world we live in. With this model, students are given the opportunity to apply the skills they have learned in the classroom. With experiential learning, students are able to connect with the theory in a more tangible way than with traditional schooling in such a rapidly changing world. Hands-on experience with problem solving, project building, and collaborative learning are some of the important skills that students will need to succeed. We strongly believe that learning through experiences is much more effective than learning through the traditional methods, because it improves creativity, since children learn that there are multiple solutions to challenges. Moreover, because students have the opportunity to reflect by incorporating concrete experiences with abstract concepts, and then reflecting on the outcome, the students engage more regions of the brain and make stronger connections with the material. Throughout our second language learning experience, we were taught vocabulary and grammar items in an explicit way that are stored in our declarative memory, but we want our students to automatize knowledge and to rely on their procedural memory. For example, when teaching the topic of prepositions, we can take students to the backyard and make them perform instructions such as put your feet under the stair, put your hands on your head, jump over the box, or walk across the room. Through experiential learning in this lesson plan, students would learn to use different prepositions like under, on, over, and across. Then, after reflecting on our students' outcomes, we should be able to discuss the use of these prepositions. Finally, our students should be prepared to successfully apply what they have experientially learned in the real world.
As we were truly interested in the benefits of bilingualism, we decided to investigate a little bit more, and we found an interesting paper about the advantages of bilingualism in people that suffer from schizophrenia. Due to the large migrations over the past 3 decades, large numbers of individuals with schizophrenia are learning a second language and being seen in clinics in that second language. Dr. Smirnova conducted within-subject comparisons to clarify the contribution of clinical, linguistic, and bilingual features in the first and second languages of bilinguals with schizophrenia. 10 bilingual proficient patients, whose L1 was Russian and their L2 was Hebrew, developed clinical schizophrenia after achieving proficiency in both languages, were selected from 60 candidates referred for the study. They were resident in Israel for 7 to 32 years, with 3 to 10 years from immigration to diagnosis. Clinical, linguistic, and fluency markers were coded in transcripts of clinical interviews. The results showed there was a trend toward more verbal productivity in the first language than the second language. Clinical speech markers associated with thought disorders and cognitive impairment, blocking and topic shift, were similar in both languages. Among linguistic markers of schizophrenia, incomplete syntax and speech role reference were significantly more frequent in L2 than L1. Lexical repetition and unclear reference demonstrated a trend in the same direction. For fluency phenomena, discourse markers were more prevalent in L1 than L2, and code switching was similar across languages, showing that patients were attuned to the socio-pragmatics of language use. In conclusion, more frequent linguistic markers of schizophrenia in L2 show more impairment in the syntactic, semantic components of language, reflecting greater thought and cognitive dysfunction. Patients are well able to acquire a second language. Nevertheless, schizophrenia finds expressions in that language. Finally, more frequent fluency markers in L1 suggest motivation to maintain fluency, evidenced in particular by code-switched L2 lexical items, a compensatory resource.